Welcome to the EXCELcast. I'm Jonathan Kuskiski, Assistant Director for the EXCEL program here at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And today I'm talking with our special guest, Laura Barron, on arts-based community development. Laura is the founder and executive director of Instruments of Change. She's also a flutist and does projects all around the world. So welcome, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, great to be here.
Let's just jump right in. So this whole realm of arts-based community development, it may be new to many of our viewers. So can you tell us a little bit about what that means? What is the practice of arts-based community development?
So my understanding is that this practice is something that engages community in any artistic discipline in a way that empowers and allows them to be the makers and doers of the art. But it also does so by bringing transferable benefits to that community that develop them as people and make them the owners and authors of those benefits. So basically, in my own practice, I've shifted from a model as a performer who did community engaged work through outreach and broadening audiences as passive participants in that exchange, to an educator who shares and informs and disseminates the act of art making with others, to now a facilitator where really that experience is learner and participant driven.
I see. So in a way it's sort of translating or transforming the relationship, right, between the sort of performer and the audience into that of co-creators for some sort of larger benefit for a community.
Absolutely.
Right? Great. Okay, well let's talk a little bit about Instruments of Change then. So how do you, as the leader of that organization, how do you practice arts-based community development through that or through other projects as well?
Yeah, so for me, as a classical musician, I was following traditional models, typically, as I mentioned, of outreach or teaching to marginalized communities, but I was doing what I might call community development work as a non-musician. So I was teaching yoga in a prison, I was working at a downtown East Side homeless shelter, those kinds of things, but trying to find a way to intersect the two. How could I create a model using my area of expertise that was really a hand up, not a hand out? And so I basically met a lot of community artists, particularly in fields outside of music, because there's such robust practices in theater, in visual art, in dance, of these kinds of community development arts engagements, and got inspired to develop a model which became Instruments of Change. And really it's the umbrella for a number of independent endeavors that I was getting involved in Vancouver with this community of artists I was meeting as a way to sort of legitimize what we were doing, fundraise for what we were doing. Yeah. So
rather than starting with the idea for this umbrella organization, you started on projects that developed organically through your drive and your network and your curiosity that then sort of demanded, as they grew, an umbrella to help support them.
That's exactly
right? Okay.
the evolution, yeah.
I see.
So, but quite early on, I will say. So all pretty much in the year of 2010. I took a class at Simon Fraser University by one of my mentors, Judith Marcuse, who's the director of the International Center on Arts for Social Change, which has a great online resource and is doing amazing work around the world. And there were several of us from all over different artistic sectors, as well as the social service sector, coming together looking to find social impact for our work or to infuse social work with more artistic activity. And through that I built a community of collaborators and actually a collective called Something Collective with a visual artist, dancer, filmmaker, puppeteer, and myself. And after a couple of projects we decided and realized there were a lot of grants we weren't eligible for, that having something overarching and having charity status was going to be beneficial. And then I went through with some friends outside of the musical realm who were marketing experts and strategic experts and business experts, a strategic planning process and a 5-year business plan process to really get a clear vision on what that organization should be, what our mission was, articulating our objectives, and from there, many other initiatives have grown.
That's great. Well, why don't we talk, could you give us a couple examples of specific projects and how they've delivered value in different ways within this realm of
yeah,
community-based
so being very moved by this idea of making the participant, the maker and doer, and letting them lead the direction of the project, I didn't start originally doing classical music engagements because that obviously can have its barriers. You know, I was teaching yoga in a women's prison, and I wanted to serve that community with a musical project. I wasn't likely to teach them flute, so I ended up starting a rock music program called Women Rock there, and aligning myself with some great rock music experts, all female instructors. And that was our first program, and it is our still longest running and most successful program. But of course, I've been always looking for ways to intersect my area of expertise and passion as a classical musician and this work. So one of the first real successes in doing that was a project called Voice to Voice. It was a partnership with University of British Columbia and a woman called Rena Sharon, who's a piano professor there. And then also a community organization called the Thursdays Writing Collective. They had existed for 7 years. They meet on the page, as they say, every Thursday, mostly marginalized people from the inner city, but really incredible creators and poets and weavers of words. And they meet September to May every year, and always that season is themed, which is helpful. So in some way there's prompts that they work around in impromptu co-writing activities. And so I partnered with Ellie Gardner, their director, who loved this concept of connecting these writers with graduate student composers and performers from the university, two very different silos that don't normally have both geographic nor sort of other kinds of interactions together. And basically they wrote around the theme of music and transformation year long in a variety of ways, poetic, narrative, otherwise. And we also had the community of composers already predetermined, and we were building relationships between the composers and the writers. Sometimes the composers came to the Thursday writing jams and got out of their comfort zone and worked on the writing prompts, and sometimes the writers went to UBC, which was generally an arena they had not felt so invited in before, and did some collaborative, facilitated workshops with the composers, and we really created an understanding throughout the project that this was not charity. This was not something being handed to them, your right to have your words turned into professional classical music. It was really a very symbiotic, collaboratively beneficial project. But the idea was ultimately, through a curation process, hundreds of pieces were written pieces were created and curated, and 11 were selected to be composed into art song, voice and piano music. And then those were performed by UBC students on campus, but also in the downtown east side, and both communities came to one another, and it was also documented on CBC National Radio, a whole documentary about the process.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. So a couple of things just to take away from that, I think. One is this, you spoke at the very beginning about this idea of facilitation and your role as a facilitator. And this gives us sort of a bird's eye view of what that means, right? So it seems, just hearing about this project, I can imagine there are multiple phases to it. There are also multiple sort of areas of work that need to be facilitated. There's an administrative sort of track of work, right? That's getting the right people connected at the right times, and paperwork, and those other things that need to be done. Then there's a sort of the on-the-ground facilitation and collaboration, right, with other professionals to implement the program at its different phases, if that's right. And then there's sort of also the assessment and the follow-up and the kind of reporting. I don't know if you had to do that in this case with any kind of grant money, but quite often that's a piece that is very intimidating to people that might first and foremost consider themselves performers, because that part is often not part of our process. So, I mean, does that sound fairly representative?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, I mean, embarking on a process or on a project like that, did you have certain, when you were in the midst of that work, did you kind of identify those as individual pieces, or were you just sort of swimming through and learning as you went?
I think I had led enough initiatives at that point to understand what pieces needed to be in place, as had Ellie. And we had federal funding. We had a Canada Council grant for that,
Yeah.
and they already also
see.
dictate what those phases need to be.
Yeah.
And over the years, I've come to be a lot more patient with my work and
Yeah.
understood that seeds of ideas take many years sometimes to come to fruition, and that often these things unfold over a very slow period of time. So the idea came from Rena at UBC. 2 years before the project started, and a number of community partnerships and funding seeking and other steps happened before the first day we all met on the page downtown. So I think we did have a clearer vision from the onset for this particular project, but for sure in the past our approach has been more reactive as it can be, especially when you're trying something new.
I see. That's great. So as a follow-up to that, I'm just wondering, maybe this is more applicable to experience early on when you first got involved, but I'm wondering which skills or skill sets you feel like you brought with you to this work that you might not have at the time 10 years ago or whenever before you got involved in this work imagine could be transferred in such a way. So I feel like a lot of times performing artists have hidden skills or skills that they actually have a capacity to do a lot of this kind of work, but they've never exercised those skills in that context. So could you talk a little bit about some of the skills you found transferred into this work that you already had, you never imagined you had all along?
Yeah, well, I think I have always thought about transferable skills, and I was a university professor for 10 years, and putting a whole bunch of people out there in the world with performance degrees and knowing what the odds are of having performance careers, it was always important to me to make students understand their transferable skills and train them to diversify their skills and understand themselves as more whole people. But if I had to kind of pick 3 things, I think it's skills as a collaborator, a communicator, and a project manager. And those are things that all of us, anyone who's had to prepare a senior recital, anyone who has worked with an audience throughout their lifetime, anyone who's been in chamber ensembles, which can be mini marriages and larger ensembles, and worked under conductors, understands the sensitivity required for these kinds of delicate, co-creative relationships. And then the project management piece is sort of, I do think of like preparing a project like Voice to Voice as sort of a macrocosm of preparing your senior recital, right? I mean, there's still all those steps that you have to think about. Time management is important, understanding all of the pieces that are going to make it thrive.
That's great advice. I think there's also one I think it's probably within everything you've said, but one additional sort of point that I've noticed just from hearing you talk about these experiences is a need to embrace sort of curiosity and openness to new experiences and to contexts beyond, a lot of, specifically I think about classical musicians, perhaps more than other performing arts disciplines, as was my personal experience. It's very easy to create a very narrow network, right? Maybe a wonderful, rich network in terms of the people themselves, but in terms of the breadth of what they do in the community and which ways they engage with community can be very narrow. And it sounds like so many stories that we hear, they sound like it's just happenstance that leads to an opportunity. But it seems to me that the opportunity to find that moment of happenstance comes from being constantly curious and outgoing and engaging. So could you talk a little bit about that?
To quote Oprah, she says, "Preparation is luck meeting." Luck is preparation meeting opportunity, right? Luck is preparation meeting opportunity. Exactly. So, well, if I can think about my own personal curiosity and just nature, in addition to what drove me to be a classical musician, I also have been an avid traveler and just someone really interested in other cultures. And what moves me so much in this work is the cross-cultural communication that is fostered. So Voice to Voice, for example, has 2 very unlikely collaborating groups. And that maybe is my favorite thing to facilitate. And to find intersection in those voices, which invariably are there. And to develop empathy for the differences in those cultures, too. One of the projects I'm doing now is called the Binner's Symphony and has me interacting with a community I might have never imagined meeting, and that is the people that we consider our foremost recyclers in Vancouver. So you may have this here in Ann Arbor, but basically those people who crawl through the alleys with their shopping carts and make their living collecting recyclables. We have a very vibrant community of people who are doing that, and they're doing it as not a totally viable living, but in fact they are doing so. They have a nonprofit that supports them, that's trying to bring legitimacy to them, that has them sometimes hired as the official recyclers of a street festival or that kind of thing. And I've been very interested in upcycling for a long time. Like my sort of early social justice days was as an environmental advocate and educator.
Okay.
So it's no coincidence that so many of my projects now seem to be around trash and making instruments out of trash and working with puppeteers who make puppets out of trash and all kinds of things. And so this is a big community-wide STOMP project that we're facilitating for the International Society of Contemporary Music Conference that's going to be hosted in Vancouver in November. And really it was this puppeteer friend who is a master upcycler who suggested we engage the binners themselves as our instrument curators. And so we built relationships with this Binners Project nonprofit for a year to really understand the needs of that community, the assets of that community. And in fact, they had a great interest in using their, expert ears and eyes and ability to see value in things others of us see as trash. To basically find the instruments that became our fleet for this project. And I actually got to be in the alleys with them, up and down with the shopping carts, looking for what became our instruments. And we guided them a bit with sort of, what we showed them some stomp videos and other people doing that work around the world, and we showed them some things that might be conducive to percussion instruments, but we also let their imaginations run wild, and they really got invested. We had a community of about 8 binners helping us for several months to find the instruments, and then some of them actually also became participants and performers in the band. And that is another great intersection with the classical music world, because ultimately that ensemble is now going to collaborate with a professional brass band in a commissioned and composed piece that will be premiered at that conference. So again, to pretty unlikely communities you'd never imagine being able to share creative space on stage, and yet it's extremely empowering and confidence building for both groups, because I think, as you've explained, we sometimes feel marginalized in our own way as classical musicians and maybe cloistered, and they do in different ways, and to gain the confidence that we can communicate with these people, we can build understanding with these people, we can find shared purposes, I think extremely enriching. It's like traveling in your own city.
Absolutely. Well, it's very inspiring to hear you talk about this, because it kind of, there's an analogy, I think, to, when you talk about the same concepts within the world of entrepreneurship, which is essentially, yes, you have to diversify your skills, but you have to diversify the people that you work with as well, and bring together people that have different perspectives, common goals perhaps, but have different skill sets, different modalities of expressing it, to find a way to collaborate. And often that is what leads to really, much more impactful results. So
it's been my experience for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming to us today. It's talking to us a little bit about your work in arts-based community development, and we look forward to watching what you do in the future.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks so much.